Hello, my most beloved and murderous horde, and welcome back. I am your mistress of murder, and you all by now know my son Charlie. Say hello, Charlie. Plague, a contagious bacterial disease characterized by fever and delirium, typically with the formation of rashes and sometimes even an infection in the lungs. I did a poll on Twitter, and you asked for it, my horde. As I asked you earlier this week as to what video you wanted, you chose to divulge into one of the world's most infamous pestilences, the Black Plague. And, to add to the theme of this video, I've decided that the video should be one of my favorite games of all time. The game is called Plague Inc., and it is available on mobile and on Steam. So, shall we begin? You know the drill by now, my lovelies. Pick your poison, sit back, relax, and let's have ourselves a little conversation. The year was 1343, and England was about to face what would change the history of the world forever. The great pestilence, known as the Black Plague, traveled through the Silk Road trade route and by ships carrying rat infested with fleas that brought along the bacteria Yersinia pestis, also known as the Black Death, the Black Plague, and the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia and peaking in Europe from the years 1347 to 1351. This death toll has been estimated to have killed roughly 1/3 of the entire world's population in the short span of only 4 years. And it would take the world 200 years for it to return to its previous population levels. The Black Death was not the first major European outbreak of plague, and was actually the second pandemic. The plague created a number of religious, social, and economic upheavals, which had profound effects on the course of European history. The Black Death is thought to have originated in the dry plains of Central Asia, where it traveled along the Silk Road and by ship, reaching Europe by the year of 1343. From there, it was most likely carried by fleas living on the backs of rats that traveled on the merchant ships, spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin and Europe. The plague recurred as outbreaks in Europe until the 19th century. And now, my horde, it has returned, reportedly in LA, California, the United States of America. Contemporary accounts of the plague are often varied and imprecise. The most commonly noted symptom was the appearance of painful swellings in the groin, neck, thighs, and armpits, such as welts or pustulous welts. These welts oozed pus and bled when open. A description of the plague reads as follows. In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of uncertain tumors in the groin, armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two said parts of the body, it soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently. After which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere. Now few and large, now minute and numerous. As the malady had began, and still was infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomever they showed themselves. The only medical detail that is questionable in this description is the spots being an infallible token of approaching death, as if the discharges made recovery possible. This is, however, incorrect. The Black Death at the time was quite fatal. These spots, black spots, which actually gave the name of the plague as the Black Death, this was followed by an acute fever and vomiting of blood. Most victims died 2 to 7 days after initial infection. Freckle-like spots and rashes, which could have been easily caused by flea bites, were identified as another potential sign of the plague. Some accounts, like that of Heinrich, who was the master Cardinal Column, died of the plague in 1348, noticed a distinct form of the disease that infected the lungs and led to respiratory problems, and is identified with the pneumonic plague, one of the 3 forms that the plague takes. In the first people to suffer an infection of the lungs, which leads to breathing difficulties. Whomever had this corruption or contamination to any extent cannot escape, but will die within 2 days. Another form in which boils erupt under the armpits, and a third in which people of both sexes were attacked in the groin. It is from these symptoms that a childhood folk song was born in more than one country. One that many in the English-speaking world know as Ring Around the Rosie. Now, there are 2 versions of this song that I am currently aware of. There's the British version, and then there is the American version. The British version goes as such. Ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. The American version is very similar, but with one exception. The American one is, ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Now, breaking these rhymes down, and the overly mostly accepted meaning behind it is as follows. The ring around the rosy is referring to the rosy or red rashes that would form on most of the infected, as rashes was a common symptom of the bubonic plague and even the pneumonic plague. 2. A pocket full of posies. Posies, as some of you may know, were flowers, and very fragrant ones indeed. These posies were often used to hide the smell of death on the individuals that were infected. They were also used by the infamous plague doctors to help them filter out any of the bad smells, which I'll explain later, in their rather horrifying-looking masks. Now, in the British version, a tissue, it is believed that a tissue was to represent the symptoms of the plague that affected the lungs. Ashes, ashes in the American version, however, represented the cremation of the dead in mass numbers, as the plague could still infect the living that were even near those who had died of the plague, as necrosis can still harbor the bacteria, and due to the lack of hygienic qualities in that particular era, this was very common. It was also incredibly common for people to have to step over the dead in their own doorways in this time period. And the last part, we all fall down, well, that is a simple statement of the mass death. As I said before, the Black Plague was not the first nor the last mass plague to devastate the world. It was, in fact, the second of 3 known plagues in history. The first was known as the Plague of Justinian. The second was, of course, the Black Plague or the Bubonic Plague, and the third was the Plague of London. The Black Plague is the most notorious of these 3, as it is not only the most well documented, but it was also one of the deadliest of the 3 plagues, and is the 8th deadliest pandemic in human history. The image shown here is roughly what 1/3 of Europe would be in a reference, or 1/3 of the population that was killed off. Now, there were 3 types of the Black Plague: the bubonic plague, the systemic plague, and the pneumonic plague. Now, the signs and symptoms of each plague generally developed between 2 and 7 days after the person acquired the infection. Now, the Black Plague also caused about a 100-year economic crisis and is infamous for being the plague with the perfect storm of events. You see, when this plague hit, and the reason why it was so utterly devastating is due to a few reasons. The plague occurred during a climate change. Even a much colder climate had settled into Europe than what was the norm. Now, this caused a very poor harvest in a very agricultural economy. So, not only were people very malnourished and were also in an economic downslide, they were also at war. Europe was very much in a warring area at the same time as the Black Plague, which not only helped the sickness spread, but also made people injured from the war more at risk of dying from the illness. Now, not only did the Black Plague change the history of Europe in general, interestingly enough, it also changed warfare forever. Before the plague, warfare was typically huge drawn-out battles, much like the Hollywood portrays in its fantasy-style movies. However, after the plague, due to the less amount of people, warfare became more of a surge style. Meaning, instead of long, huge, drawn-out battles of two armies clashing, it became more of a, I attack your main city, you attack one of mine, and that back and forth. However, perhaps what is most iconic and what most people think of when they think of the Black Plague is actually the doctors, with their bird-like masks, sticks, and full-body cloaks. This garb was used to protect the doctors from the plague, and I use the word doctors lightly, as many were not at all doctors or had any medical training whatsoever. They were more so inventory takers and would only tally all of those who had died of the plague in a certain area and keep records of it. The garb itself is also interesting. The masks of the plague doctors were actually filled with flowers and very fragrant plants, as it was believed that the plague was spread through bad smells and tainted air. The long cloaks, gloves, etc. were meant to do much of the same. Now, as we all know now that this plague was not at all spread through the air, and their theory on how it was spread was grossly incorrect. However, the garb actually did do a good job in keeping the doctors safe. The masks, and even the long canes and sticks that the plague doctors used, actually did prevent them from getting the plague themselves, as it kept the fleas off of them and away from the bacteria. Interestingly enough, the garb we see today is more akin to the garb used in plays long after the Black Death had struck, rather than what the real plague doctors actually wore. But you do have to admit, they would make a menacing sight to see in your city. There are a few other facts of the Black Death that I would like to share with you. The Black Death actually killed about 50% of all people living in Paris, 40% of people in Egypt, and 60% of people in London. Bathing was actually discouraged throughout the plague because people thought it opened the pores to the disease, rather than washing away the fleas and drowning them, as we would encourage today. Cats and rats were actually also infected with the disease, however, dogs remained perfectly fine. William Shakespeare actually also witnessed the terrifying consequences of the Black Death, and it even makes appearances in some of his works. The philosopher Nostradamus was actually one of the first plague doctors, and wooden coffins were actually painted with a red cross to show the bodies inside had died from the Black Plague and should not be opened. The term quarantine was even coined during this area, and the Black Death was then eventually used as early germ warfare. And as I stated before, my murderous horde, the Black Death seems to have returned, as it has been spotted in Los Angeles, California, in the United States of America. It is a common misconception that the Black Plague ever really went away. In fact, it has only ever been labeled as dormant, and has never been fully eradicated. It has popped up several times in developing countries throughout history, but only now has it entered a first world country, though I can't say I am entirely surprised that it ended up in the city that it did. Although I will say, it will be very interesting to see how you mortal humans, and the world in general, handles the Black Death a second time. And that is all the time I have for you for now, my lovelies. And remember, haunting dreams, and blessed be.